to our guests, Dr. Handfield and Dr. Finkenstadt. Take it from here, gentlemen.
Thanks, Richard. Good afternoon, everybody. Is it afternoon for you there? I think it is. Yeah, still morning for me, but it's afternoon for everyone there. As Richard said, I'm Major Dan Finkenstadt. Everyone calls me Fink. I'm a professor out here at the Naval Postgraduate School. I actually specialize in enterprise sourcing and acquisition education, but a big part of that is supply market intelligence and some of the areas that cross into supply chain. I've been working with Rob for over a year now, both on the COVID-19 task force, the initial response, and then in future research and stuff in different areas. Still related some to COVID, some to other areas, supply chain disruptions like natural rubber, etc. Rob, I'll turn it over to you before I pull up the slides. You can do an intro.
Yeah, hi, this is Rob Handfield. I'm a professor of supply chain management. I've been doing this for about 30 years. Prior to coming to NC State, I was at Michigan State and worked with a lot with the folks in the automotive sector and electronic sector. I've had the opportunity to work more with public acquisition through GSA, Veterans Affairs, most recently with DoD. And so I really see both sides of public and private sector acquisition, and understand that there are some differences, but there's obviously some opportunities as well to learn from each other.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my slides. Hopefully this will work for me. There we go. All right. Can we see the slides now?
Not yet. Oh, there we go.
Got them?
Good.
Okay. Great. All right, everybody. So this is our chapter session related to what we gave at SubCon. So in the agenda, what we want to cover is a brief look at the supply chain landscape in America, a little bit of the regulatory landscape and what we see coming out, some key attributes of supply chain immunity, which is a concept that Dr. Handfield has been writing about for some time, and then a couple papers that we did together. One is published called Blurry Vision, and the other one is about to be published related to value chain signals. And these are based on experiences we had observing the COVID-19 response, but we believe that they are indicative of systematic supply chain issues. And so we think they're a good representation of what we should talk about. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to let Rob talk a little bit about, especially from his experience in having a lot more insight into the global supply chain, what we're facing here in America and how globally that's shifted in the last decade. So Rob.
Yeah, so I've been, like I said, I've been teaching procurement for about 30 years, and one of the early on in my career, about in the early 2000s, I was able to take a trip to Shanghai and do some exec ed over there, and you can kind of get an idea of what the world looked like in 2000. A lot of the manufacturing was done in certain sectors, really focused on Germany, Japan, and the United States. China was not really as big a player then. You were starting to see a lot of production beginning to go to China because it was a low-cost country. And as a lot of the sourcing went to China, the Chinese government very often required that you have a 50% partner. Well, the objective of having a 50% partner, of course, was so they could learn directly from American and German companies, and in some cases adopt their IP and then call it their own. So there was a lot of low-cost sourcing that was then moving to China. But at the time, really, as you can see, Germany was really the major manufacturer along with Japan, a little bit in the U.S., but not so much. And when I took a trip to Shanghai, it really was almost like a developing country. It was pretty rough in parts of the country, and you would see rice fields being laid down for roads and factories, and it was still kind of in the early stages. Well, fast forward to 2017, 2018, 2019. China has now become the hub of manufacturing for the world. You can see that Japan is basically not doing a lot. Germany is still sort of focused on the high-tech sectors. still supporting, the U.S. and a lot of Europe. But China really has grown and has become a global player, not just to the U.S., but to other parts of the world, especially in Latin America and other places. And this has been problematic because, as we saw during COVID, it's one thing to say, well, we outsource to China to get the lowest cost, but then when you start to see all of your pandemic requirements, medical supplies, masks, ventilators, and even pharmaceutical medicines now, a lot of those, the APIs are produced in China. And during COVID, we saw those export ceased because of border closures. And that really led us to a very exposed position where we were not able to get access to even N95 masks, even a lot of the medicines for the ICU. And we're seeing this today with semiconductor chips as well. Not so much out of China. A lot of the semiconductors are coming out of Taiwan and Japan. But here again, we're starting to see some real problems in terms of access to those critical materials. So from a DoD perspective, the DoD is very much more exposed than it was in the past. And I'm currently scheduled to testify to a Senate committee in May on this exposure and what do I think should be done about it. So we can talk a little bit more about some of those things going forward in some of the ideas that we think are going to be important. We know that Biden's, and we're going to talk about Biden's executive order as well. And people think, well, this is something that we can just bring back to the United States. Well, guess what, guys? We're talking about 20 years of outsourcing to low-cost countries. You cannot snap your fingers and, on a dime, bring it all back. It's a little more complicated than that. And that's another thing that we want to talk about here today. Dan, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. All right. You got the slide still? I had a technical difficulty there.
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So I'll leave it on this because when I go to full screen, it seems to cause problems. All right. So Rob, exactly right. And even some of the countries that we've seen some promise in that think that they're going to do some insourcing. Like Rob and I were just talking this morning about India and their current problem with the major spike in cases, and their the possible risk to an industry that is looked at as a high manufacturing hub for pharmaceuticals. But digging into this, as of January, 70% of their ingredients for pharmaceuticals is still coming from China. Right, so even that location is under duress, and so it's to Rob's point, it's not going to happen overnight. Getting into the legislative landscape, a couple of the EOs that recently came out that are worth noting. Most of you may be familiar with 14,005. This is the one that's essentially the newest Buy American Act update. It goes into a couple things that are new, such as establishing a director of Made in America, which may be of some use. But then it goes into sort of like the cost percentage that determines something to be a domestic source. And instead of it just relying on cost percentages, they want to go to an increased amount of value added, which is not defined. So remains to be seen what comes out of that. That it's just worth noting that there is a push towards domestic. But as Rob and I have talked about, and he just brought up, we can't just push for domestic because it sounds good. You actually have to see, is it possible in those areas, and what's the right strategy to do that? The other EO, which was a little bit more detailed and targeted, is 14,017, which is specific to supply chain resilience. And it calls out things like semiconductors, advanced packaging, EV batteries, rare earth elements, and these same pharmaceutical ingredients we were talking about in India, and specifically calls for there to be a 100-day review of sort of like what's the condition of that, and some of this is owned by the DoD, some of it's owned by DHHS, some of it, by Department of Energy. So there's this 100-day review that's coming out of that, which is like actionable. How much detail they can do in 100 days remains to be seen if they can, bring the right people together to answer the call. Then there's also within this executive order a desire to do an annual report on the state of the defense industrial base for DoD, the state of the health and industrial base for DHHS, etc. Rob and I have also been lucky enough, and this is part of why he's going to be testifying. We've been reviewing a lot of draft legislation. So we got 3 bills from Senator Peters' office out of Michigan that were related to advanced manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and devices, and then transparency in the delivery of critical COVID needs. So we completed that review back in, I believe, December. And then earlier this year, we completed a review for Senator Coons and Rubio's offices related to this idea of a national guard for manufacturing, which includes this idea of using apprenticeship corps through the university system, and then a central data exchange across companies. Remains to be seen how that can be implemented, and we're working on possibly putting together some academic, industry, government discussion panels to weed out the details. That piece of legislation is very action-based and has very prescriptive language in it about what can be done. What we are a little bit concerned about is that it's only manufacturing focused and doesn't consider the fact that we are still going to have to source things outside of the U.S. and we need to have a much stronger strategy around our sourcing moving forward. As Rob and I went through this experience with COVID and then some of the other supply chain issues we've seen, we sort of teased out with a group of other researchers these key attributes of supply chain immunity. The idea of having a flexible system, one in which you can transparently see what you have and trace it, the idea to persistently be monitoring that and be responsive to it, what we've talked about before about global independence and the idea that you can't just onshore everything. And then what COVID brought to light more than anything was this idea of equitable sourcing and distribution. When you're talking about something like a vaccine, that may not always be a concern within a supply chain, but it is one that was uniquely present here and that we saw people really weren't prepared to deal with. And the more we've worked with groups like WHO and the COVAX team, we're seeing that that's still a problem at a global scale. Rob, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
No, I think these are some really important characteristics, and it's not going to be easy to get these in place. We're starting from a place where, as Dan said, during COVID, we were talking to the SNS, we were talking to FEMA, we were talking to CDC. These agencies don't talk to one another. They operate in silos. And one of the things that we're seeing is to really be able to respond effectively to this kind of an emergency or other kinds of emergency, whether it's cyber terrorism, regular plain old terrorism, weather kinds of things. We've got to be able to work together and to work across agencies and bring in the right experts. So we think there's a combination of really strong market intelligence that's required to understand what's going on in that marketplace, what's going on in the world, be able to translate that to a portfolio of inventory and supplies that's going to be required, and then to have a supply chain network that's capable of delivering those supplies and materials, in an agile fashion. We think there's a role here also for perhaps the VA to be able to manage inventory, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we also think there's an approach that's needed to ensure equitable distribution of this to the states. One of the things that we saw during COVID was that sometimes it was the states, who squeaked the loudest that got the grease. And honestly, and I was talking to a couple of guys at GMU yesterday, and they're saying, the legislation around this probably goes back to the Cold War. There really isn't any good policies right now about how to distribute emergency supplies across the country to places that require it in an ethical, fair fashion. And politics aside, I think it was not done very well the last time because there really wasn't a policy to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think, Rob, as you look kind of going from right to left on this, the strategy about equitability is going to have to be done almost at a global scale. That's not going to be just a domestic policy. Global independence itself is another strategy that is going to be a combination, and we've talked about this, about domestic sourcing, Pan-American sourcing, and as well as like how we share data with partners globally within the supply chain to make sure that we can react to issues before they become a problem, or maybe like get ahead of them. Persistent responsiveness, this is a key area for contracting folks, especially because at least within the Air Force, we're charged with a great degree of the market intelligence, whether we should be or not. I mean, I know we pretend that and write in that that's an end user requirement, but at the end of the day, contracting ends up bearing a lot of the burden for monitoring that. And so how do we use stronger, models for market intelligence, business intelligence, to make sure that we're constantly looking at the right places for the right amount of time at the right level and can respond appropriately. The traceability and transparency is where you can get, technology can really help support that, either through blockchain, distributed ledger technology. Rob's written a lot on the idea of data lakes and control towers for supply chains that can help with that. And then flexibility is really going to be probably the most tactical thing that we can do that bleeds across everything, which is like we can start building in flexibility at the contract by contract level. How do we bring in agile contracting terms and conditions that allow us to pivot when circumstances occur that require us to move money or change the terms and conditions based on the conditions of the world? So, as well as, are we aware, and this gets to the traceability and the flexibility within those contracts below the prime level, below the first tier sub. And even, Rob's world, they really talk about trying to get down to the second and third tier subs as being, where a lot of the action happens for getting ahead of this. Within government supply chains, I might argue we need to go even further because we have so many people built into the system that basically just pass through. They're just grabbing, materials and selling them to the next person who sells them to the next person. But we really got to get down to like the raw materials level and making sure that we have insight into what's occurring there. I mean, we're going to have to put some of that on contractors to be responsible, but how do we verify that they're being responsible? And that's something we've got to look at. We want to go over a couple of the stories that we. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I think one of the key roles for the Air Force is also around, this idea of market intelligence. I think we need to have early warning systems on, what's going on out there. And one of our recommendations was that, the Air Force is probably the best at this from a sourcing perspective, is mapping out and looking at what's going on around the world. There's really no single tool or technology that can do it. It really does require talking to subject matter experts, building a network of people, and using multiple sources. And anyone who's worked, I've done some work with the CIA and how they do this, and it really is an intelligence analysis of what's the question you're trying to answer, and then using multiple sources and just digging and digging to see what's going on out there, and keeping and monitoring what's happening in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, having worked in the intelligence community, I see a direct correlation to the way we should be managing our market intelligence, for sure. A couple of cases we were going to go over just to give you an example of kind of how we saw the world during the COVID situation that is still occurring and probably occurring in all sorts of other supply chains, is this idea we wrote on called blurry vision, which is sort of, we observed that we were getting random levels of stock being reported as to what was available within hospital systems, within federal agencies, and everyone was telling a different story. Politicians were reporting that we didn't have a problem. Hospitals were screaming we absolutely had a problem. Since COVID's occurred, we've put a bunch of money into the domestic PPE market, and we have all these domestic sources now, but yet we have small hospital systems that claim, and clinics that claim that they can't get what they need, while these domestic sources are saying they can't sell what they've created. And so why does this occur? And so we looked at that and sort of tried to create an ontology for talking about sort of this hidden stock within the supply chain. And of course, our example was PPE, but what we observed was there's sort of these like four main bins of things that don't fall into the visible, accessible stock level, right? And that's the full spectrum of what's there. Ghost stock is actually not available, but it's this politically motivated discussion around this trying to keep the storyline positive, right? And a lot of that's built around career building, political pressure. But then there's safety stock, which was something we saw happen really early on, which is what most of you would think of as hoarding. China definitely brought up distribution barriers. It created a block stock situation for us early on. And then we observed across the entire network, when everyone's scrambling for the same thing at the same time, this idea of invisible stock, which is that it's there, but it's completely blocked by fog of war and poor tracking systems. I think that invisible stock is something that we can handle with technology. Block stock is something we're going to handle with policy. Safety stock is going to be a combination of technology and policy. And ghost stock is going to have to be handled probably at the ballot box. It's the only way I can think of how we get people around, changing the story from what it really is. Rob, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add here.
Well, I think that kind of says it all, and we saw this a lot, during COVID as well. Hospitals were often hoarding material. They wanted to keep it for their patients, and nurses, do this a lot. And I've seen it. They hoard stuff in cabinets in the back rooms, and they don't. It's almost like they don't trust the system to be able to deliver, and justifiably they did not deliver. One of the doctors I spoke with said, this is the first time that I felt like this country didn't have my back when I couldn't even get, N95 masks, to be able to treat patients, and that's how a lot of people felt. And so I think we really have to give some health or some thought to where inventory is in the system. And we saw this with the SNS as well, where there really were really rudimentary ways of tracking material, and there wasn't any way of even ensuring that it wasn't going to expire. So what happened when the pandemic hit is we had a bunch of N95 masks that were left over from 2009 from SARS. And literally, you try to put them on, the elastic band would break. It was so brittle. I mean, that's what we had in stock. And so we really need to have a better way of managing inventory and material, especially for these kinds of emergencies when they come up. And it's not enough to just say, well, we've got a stockpile, we've got lots of stuff in there, and hoarding it. That doesn't work because it expires. You got to be able to turn it. You got to have visibility. You got to understand where it is in the system. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is to think about ways to do this in an innovative fashion, thinking out of the box. And one of the opportunities that I mentioned earlier is VA hospitals. They're all over the country. They use a lot of these materials, masks and gloves, and we can keep them in stock there with visibility through transparency systems. And then when they reach, when they start getting close to their expiration, maybe within 6 months, we release them back into the VA system and consume that stock. So I think there's some innovative out of the box thinking that's required to be able to manage this problem.
Yeah, I agree, Rob. And I think what we can add, if you're sitting there, managing Air Force systems and thinking like, how does this PPE thing have anything to do with me? I would just say this is a supply chain theme that you will see anytime that there's a potential run on the stock levels. And this is something that if I were managing a supply chain contract or something involving, products or anything like, you could even do it with limited services as well. But just to think about this as a risk framework, which is when I'm imagining my strategy, have I sat down and systematically asked myself, do I know what's available? And have I accounted for the fact that some of that could be invisible, blocked, hoarded, or just, a good news story that doesn't actually exist, right? And so it's just more of a systematic way to think about it and manage the risk within your supply chain. In terms of solutions, we offered, Rob went through the just-in-time, living stockpile model through VA. Strategic sourcing plans are something that, we try to do within category management, but really something that, we could push down into our sustainment centers, I would think. And maybe you are all doing that and I'm unaware, but making sure that your critical items have strategic sourcing plans, making sure that you're managing phase delivery and stock rotations. And then this one at the bottom has been the biggest difficult situation for us to try to get, is you got to understand that lack of transparency and information asymmetry within a market is a competitive advantage for a firm. So if you're asking them to share data across stakeholders that might include other suppliers, how do you incentivize that? And what are you going to do to sort of help them recover the competitive value that they lose by sharing data. So some of the things we have to think through. All right, I'll move along. The other example we wanted to talk about was within the vaccine itself. And so this is the value chain signals, a cold chain story. And this is a paper that's coming out soon. But it's this idea of saying like, hey, anytime we look at our supply chain, we need to create a value chain all the way from raw materials to disposal. And along each of these nodes, imagine each of these images is a node and each arrow is a channel. Are we systematically breaking down the risks and what can happen along all of those areas? And are we thinking about this differently instead of saying like, I just need data, but actually starting with what decisions might we have to make? And given that we have to make those types of decisions, what signals would enable that decision to be made the most effective way? And given that those signals are the best signals to make those decisions, where should we pull the data from and how should we make sure the data is managed in a hygienic and appropriate fashion? And so this is what we're trying to push forward, which is this idea of using value chain analysis and sort of exploding the system out and then deep diving it with the intention of knowing what are the decision signals and data along each of those nodes and channels. And to do that, Rob has a lot of experience with this and I'll let him know, but there is a model that is known throughout supply chain as the SCORE model. And Rob, you can talk to this.
Sure. So this was set up by the Supply Chain Council a few years ago, and it was a standard set of nomenclature to be able to define any supply chain into and break it down into its essential components. So plan has to do with the overall sales and operations plan for the entire system in terms of capacity, inventory, manpower, requirements to operate the system. Source is obviously mapping out your supply base, and I think that's a real opportunity for us very often. And we saw this during the pandemic. People don't know where they get their stuff. I mean, literally, people didn't realize that masks were made in China, right? And they didn't realize that gloves were made in China. And they thought, well, I can just order it from my distributor. Well, where do you think the distributor gets it? So really mapping out your sources of supply is critical. And very often what we see is the problem occurs 2 or 3 tiers down, and that's clearly the case with semiconductors. The automotive companies cannot get semiconductors. I mean, right now they're shipping Ford F-150s without all the chips in it because they can't get them. So the fuel regulator chip isn't part of the current batch of F-150s that's going out there. Their make has to do with mapping out the production network. Delivery is the whole downstream distribution piece. But then there's also the sell and the return piece. And that by sell we mean is the customer interaction, the customer service interaction, the customer feedback. But then return also has to do with the whole reverse logistics supply chain, which is important. And certainly the DoD has a lot of issues with that return supply chain. I know there's a lot of depots around the country with a lot of really old jets and parts sitting around, and no one's quite sure what to do with them. And so we got to start thinking about those reverse logistics as well.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think this is this is such a key format for how we can look at anything within our supply chain, right? And thinking about breaking that up and systematically reviewing the risks along that supply chain. So we tried to do that in the paper. This is just an example of taking the SCORE model and then breaking it into your nodes, associated activities, signals, and data. And this, we're not pretending that this is like the end all be all or 100% correct. What we're saying is this is a systematic way of reviewing it as best we could given the information we had. And this shows you the level of detail that you would want to go into. And this is at a very top level at this point. But are we systematically thinking through that the same way that we go through like a risk management framework? But we're building in early when we think about a supply chain program. What data do we want to ask for, and how are we going to based off of the signals that we need to make decisions. And so this is sort of how we see it being broken down. Again, this assumes, and I'm not blind to the idea that human resources and capital are always a major problem. And do you have the people to do this? But this assumes that there's critical resources that we're talking about, especially the ones that like President Biden's talking about in his recent supply chain EO, at least for those, can we start to manage those at this level and break things down to more appropriately manage the risk, insights, and responsiveness within those supply chains to build this level of immunity that Rob's and his co-authors have been writing about for a long time. I know within the Air Force right now, we're talking about novel supply chain approaches like additive manufacturing. Can we do 3D printing downrange and stuff like that? But if you don't systematically think about that through a score model, what gets missed, and we're actually doing some research on that here with some students at MPS, is like, if you have an issue managing a supply chain for an aircraft part, is that because of the part itself to where additive manufacturing could help? Or do you actually need to work on supply chain management because you're not going to trade away all your supply chain management? You're just going to shift from components to raw materials. So you're still going to have to manage the same level of insight and risks and know where that's coming from. And because we, typically deal with primes and just first tier subs, we have a lot less information at the raw materials level and even some of the manufacturing levels. And we're going to have to get more savvy if we're going to start taking those types of approaches to solving other problems such as low rate production. But I think that's the last bit of slides right here, Richard. So Rob, unless you had anything else, I think we could turn it over to questions.
No, I think that would be great to turn over some questions. I think again, that this is something that all of us, I think, are going to be involved in the next few years. There's a lot of discussions around supply chain at the moment. There's going to be a lot of changes, so I think there's going to be a lot of us are going to get a tap on the shoulder to get involved in some of these initiatives going forward.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, gentlemen. I guess we have the rest of the meeting to conduct some open QA, and I'll go ahead and ask a question. It may not be what you were expecting, but since you have experience just with the whole PPE situation within the past year. So what I remember, I'm 32 years old. What I remember is that shortly after like 9/11, I want to say the Department of Homeland Security was established. Really part of it to kind of facilitate the contingency response as a nation for something like that. Now, with your experience with supply chain shortages, and working with National Stockpile, have you seen changes in the way federal agencies plan to collaborate, or do you see any new agencies being established?
Yeah, let me jump in on that, and I'll let Dan work on it. I think the short answer is no. Unfortunately, when DHS was assembled, people didn't realize DHS is actually 27 different agencies, right? And they lumped them all together, but they still operate very independently. And even I talked to their chief procurement officer, and he says it's like herding goats. You cannot get any of these people to even comply with a single contract. They're off doing their own thing. And unfortunately, when you get between agencies, forget about it. One of the guys at the SNS said, I couldn't even access information, from FDA or CDC. They would not share information. And it's completely there's no interoperability on the systems between agencies. In fact, they don't even talk to each other. In fact, they in some cases there's interagency rivalries going on to position themselves. It's really a bad situation in DC at the moment, and that has to change. And so one of the recommendations we made is that, and as I mentioned earlier, when there is this kind of a crisis, they need to get people to pull together quickly. They need to pull in people from BARDA. They need to pull in people from from the SNS, from FEMA, from DHS. They need to put these people in a room together quickly and say, here's the information, let's brainstorm what we need to do. Just like you guys do it great. The Air Force, the DOD, you guys are great at responding to an emergency. Unfortunately, our federal government is not. And that's what we saw, is those delays is really what really creamed us this time around, is we just didn't respond quickly and in a rapid fashion. And by the time we did, it was too late. Dan, what do you think?
I concur with that. I think, the one thing the DoD does well, and I don't say we do it great, but we've been talking joint for a while. Now, when we say joint, we're basically talking like Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, so that's as far as joint as we got. But at least we're trying, right? The other agencies, I don't even know that they even have a concept of joint interoperability for most things, right? You'll read handbooks and they'll say like, hey, make sure you work with stakeholders. But they don't really do what we do, which is the idea, and we can do it better, by the way, which is this idea of joint O-planning, exercising, like actually getting together and exercising a scenario, building playbooks. So other activities like American Red Cross and some of these, they've learned from previous hurricanes and stuff that they need to build playbooks and actually exercise the issue, which is very similar to like what you'll see CCOs doing and stuff like that. So honestly, one of our first recommendations when they asked us how we'd redesign the SNS was we were saying like, we would actually go to a strategic national sourcing teams and we would build these like flexible teams. Some of them would be managing stock, but most of them would be managing strategic national sourcing opportunities. And we mentioned the fact that the Air Force was the right people to be advising on this because we have such a heavy contingent of contingency contracting folks, which is the entire idea, right? Like you can say, well, it's not wartime, it's HATR, but we do HATR too, humanitarian and disaster response. And really the fog of war, the opportunistic market behaviors, all the things, the hoarding, the grabbing, that exists in every contingency situation or emergency, regardless of whether it's in Afghanistan or if it's in Louisiana. It still happens the same way, right? And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned there on how we manage that. Richard, we brought up the idea back about getting firms within your supply chain to share data, right? We got to come up with the incentives to do that. But the reality is that we don't even do it within our own government. And so if we don't do it within our own government, it's going to be really hard to convince companies to do the same thing, right? So when we were doing this early on, there was a very apparent grab by different agencies to say like, well, we're not going to share that. We're going to do that internally. And I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but people within the DoD were literally putting their hand up going, you can say you did all the work. We just need the data so we can get the work done and you can take all the credit. We don't care about who gets the credit. And it was such a political situation that really harmed that. And then the last thing I'll say is never in the middle of an emergency with no planning should you announce that you're going to give out $1 trillion+ of anything, because everybody and their brother creates a company the very next day. And so we were weeding through who's legitimate, who's not. And so if you don't have a strong vendor vetting program up front, then you can't manage that, right? And so we're trying to get at that, but honestly, for the longest, it's only been around cybersecurity. Cybersecurity has been like the only vendor vetting concern that anyone's had, and there's so much more to it and how we should manage that. So that's my view.
One other thing, to that comment, Dan, which is, the SNS. Unfortunately, one of the big mistakes they made is over 50% of their budget on response supplies was for the anthrax vaccine.
Yeah.
Which was manufactured, by the way, by the same guys that botched the J&J vaccine manufacturer. It's the same company, and they basically were able to convince members of the SNS that they needed to spend over $600 million in inventory on anthrax vaccines. So they didn't spend anything on the materials that were required. And this was a political decision. It was heavily lobbied and everything else. So we've got to get away from that's, the basis of decision making needs to get away from this political influence and more objective and fact based. Long answer.
So that definitely, that's very helpful answer, gentlemen. So it definitely tells me, and I didn't know that actually about DHS, it's 27 agencies, but that does tell me that part of that is intentional to create, not allocate kind of all of the risk to one, godlike agency, if you will, but also create redundancies, kind of a network of organizations who can collaborate and kind of synchronize the way that they exchange information. So a lot of that that you guys mentioned, it is structural, but it's also cultural. But hopefully we can move towards the right direction. And so I guess I want to open the floor. We are in an open QA session just for the rest of this meeting. And so any question that you guys have pertaining to the supply chain challenges within the past year, go ahead and ask. And I would say turn on your camera and make sure to unmute yourself. All right, I guess while people are warming up their questions, I'll ask you another one. This one, so I think the long-term goal will ideally is you want real-time visibility over a supply chain. Now, that is much easier said than done. But what are some things that we as contracting officers can do to work towards that outcome in our contracts? What would you say are things that we can do?
I guess I can maybe start, and I'll get Dan to chime in. You know, I think one of the things that we can do with first of all, I would mention is the area where I see the biggest weaknesses in contracts is in the statement of work and the SLAs. You know, people do not do a very good job of really documenting what the requirement is. And very often they're rushed. You know, they're told to go out and buy something. They've got too many contracts they need to write, and they don't spend enough time, you know, specifying exactly what it is. And I've seen some really bad statements of work. I think the worst one I ever saw was, you know, when I was working with GSA, is they had a former submariner, you know, with the Navy who was, you know, now writing contracts or in RFPs for the VA, and he basically would, you know, do the old cut and paste, you know, of it was a construction project. Well, you know, this guy had been in a submarine for 20 years. He didn't know anything about construction, so he was, you know, he wasn't even using the right specs, the right standards, and he puts out a contract, and people are like, you know, RFPs like, what the heck is this? I mean, we don't even know who it is. Or these aren't even up to date. I think the other area is you know, we need to really make sure we get the RFPs out in the right amount of time to the right people, right? And I've seen also real screw ups. Again, this is another VA screw up where I was in a room with, you know, Becton Dickinson and a couple of other major pharma companies, and the CO says, well, why didn't you guys respond to my RFP? And they're looking at each other, what RFP? They weren't even notified of it, right? So there's some real, you know, mistakes that are made. So communication is really important. Spending time writing a good SOW, and then when you write the contract, and Dan and I are doing some work on this. You know, past performance is an area that we're really weak on. I don't think we do a good enough job really doing our due diligence on, you know, are we just giving business to a bad performer? Are we rewarding poor performance by continuing to give work to people that, you know, have done lousy work in the past, and we don't do our due diligence? I don't think we're really setting a good precedent there for you know, for rewarding people for the right behaviors. Dan, what are your thoughts on that?
So I got a lot. So I'll start with Richard. Like the main thing I think is, and of course I'm biased because I teach this here, but honestly, category management mindset and market intelligence is the key starting block of all this, right? It's just the idea of being like, okay, how does the market manifest? Not how do I say it exists? How does it actually manifest? What are the key concerns within the outward facing market and within my internal facing business intelligence, like how I spend money, that I need to think about and how I build that out? And then creating those strategic sourcing plans to think about how you're going to deal with that. Then the idea of imagination in risk. The idea that you can actually, it's okay to sit down and systematically imagine about risk. I just had a class on services contracting, and I told them, sit down and do two things when you're writing your requirement, and just ask these questions over and over. What if and why? What if and why? What if and why? And what does that do? What if gets at your risk cube? Why gets to your root cause? And if I know both my risks and my root cause of that risk, I can start to write requirements to prevent that from occurring, right? Or to mitigate that, right? And so that's agnostic to services. That's every contract should start with what if and why, right? And then believing that there's value in money spent in risk reduction and resilience, right? So here's the problem. Why is government so reactive? Because no one gets an OPR bullet that says, I spent $3 million and nothing bad happened. That's not a cool bullet, right? The cool bullet is like, crap was hitting the fan and I spent $3 million and I righted the ship. I kept it from going completely off the rails, right? But there still has to be a problem for me to fix. There's no way to evaluate the ship just staying steady and not letting something go wrong, right? And we have to realize that if you look at a large program office and when they're talking about technology risk, and they'll be like, well, we're not really sure the yield rate on these FPR, on these chips are going to be what we expected. So we want to go spend, $500,000 over here to do some risk reduction, and hopefully that'll increase our yield rates, right? That's seen all day long. People are like, cool, yeah, go do that. That makes sense. Yep, R&B approves, right? But we don't say like, hey, let's go spend some dollars to get supply chain insight and run some exercises to make sure that if crap ever hits the fan, we don't end up in the situation that we're in, right? Because no one said, well, that's a contingency, that's down the line, we'll deal with it when we get there, right? We don't do that, but we need to believe that there's value in that money spent. And that goes back to the exercising post-award contingencies. And I don't mean like, let's simulate a hurricane occurs. Simulate you can't get access to the material you need because of a whole host of issues. That might be a plant fire, which is overwhelmingly the reason why we have supply chain issues in the world, right? Or that there's some sort of like embargo or anything like that, right? That doesn't have to do with a natural disaster or a bomb being dropped, right? Those are still things we need to exercise through. And then the last piece, which Rob and I have seen when we're talking about how we get this data sharing, which is create incentives to drive supply chain insight. Craft incentives within your contract, within your incentive plans, whatever you have that force a level of insight into what's happening. Put a procedural on the contract, put something out there. Just because the DFARS doesn't have it right now doesn't mean you can't create it. You can create whatever you want, right? As long as it doesn't violate the DFARS, right? And I don't think it will. So just be creative in that space. The world's your oyster in this area because no one's doing it. So you can do whatever you can do what you want, and it's only going to be at least one step better than it was today. So those are just some of my big rocket issues I think you can do in contracting.
So I'll say that that's very, very insightful answer. I want to thank you, both of you gentlemen. And one thing I would say, just to tie it back to what we actually do here, everyone here supports sustainment of weapon systems, a bunch of hardware, and then also definitely we're an increasingly software-defined world. Well, one initiative that's really important for the sustainment community is this idea of condition-based maintenance. Well, what's really critical to get to that level is identifying what assets do you actually have now, and regardless of what we think about how they were engineered or what the vendor claims they were engineered, you just have to know what their actual conditions are. The sooner you can identify this asset here has had some reliability issues, it's been serviced this much, then you probably know that in those what if scenarios, this one's probably going to die first, and then you can actually use that data to plan maintenance proactively rather than put out that fire of the one that we couldn't expect, right? And so that's critical insight, knowing what are the conditions of the assets I have now, so that I can be prepared for those what ifs. So that's huge. I wanted to again just open the floor. Does anybody have any questions that they wanted to ask Professors Handfield and Finkenstadt?
So Richard, I'll add one thing when you're talking about maintenance and being proactive on that. John Rust wrote a paper in 1987 in Econometrica called Optimal Replacement of GMC Bus Engines, an empirical model of Harold Zucker, where he just went into this guy's garage, like at a city level, and started taking all the maintenance records and built a structural model to predict when they should just go ahead and replace an engine so that they didn't incur all these maintenance costs that were unnecessary, right? Because the old model was we only replace the engine when it fails. But they didn't account for all the costs build up to keep that engine just sort of limping along. And maybe that's being done at AFSC. I haven't worked at AFSC, but those are the types of things we should be thinking about, right? Which is if Roland Rust can do this in 1987, on bus engines, then we should definitely be able to do this in aircraft in 2017 or 2021, so. All right, I think I'm going to turn to a pumpkin in like 2 minutes. So.
Sure. Well, I guess I'm going to ask one last question here. I didn't quite get this part when you guys were talking about the key attributes of immunity as part of your slide. That last point was on equitable distribution, and you talked about how the government should be responsive to need as opposed to demand. I didn't quite understand, what was the difference that you're trying to get at there, need versus demand?
Okay, so if you think about the hoarding issues that we saw when you looked at the blurry vision on PPE, right? If you tell a hospital, tell me how many masks, for instance, that you need for the next 2 weeks and what you're going to need in 2 weeks, right? They are incentivized to hedge that and to sort of plus that up and give you like 150% of what they actually need, right? Because that's part of what they need to do their job. And they're hedging against bets that something's going to go wrong. Need versus demand is instead of asking for that, you say, give me a report of your 2-week utilization rate. And through your supply chain, show me how much you're using. And then I will look at that, bounce that up against the epi models that tell me like sort of the rate of infection, and say, like, given that rate of infection and the way you use PPE, because different people use it differently, I estimate you need this amount and that's how much you'll get. But when you ask people in a commons constraint where everyone's like rushing to grab, it's kind of like you right now, Richard, which is if I said, hey, we're going to put $1 trillion out into the market to deal with COVID relief. We'd like an active duty member to get some of that money. How much of that do you think you could use? You're probably going to be like, dude, I could use like $500 billion. Like, you're just going to make some number up that's like advantages you, right? You're not going to do what you actually need, And so that's the same situation as if you're in a constrained environment. If you're worried about starving next week and someone says like, how much food do you want delivered? You're probably going to overestimate what you need to deliver because you're worried about starving, right? And you're afraid that you're not going to have it the week after. And so you want to be able to carry inventory beyond the period because, the government's not known for always showing up on time. So if you tell me you're only going to replace my goods every 2 weeks, I'm going to estimate what I need for like 6 weeks to make sure that it's there just in case you don't show up when you're supposed to.
That's okay. That's perfect. That I totally clicks now because that makes sense to me. If your government, announces it has $1 trillion and you project all these, $1 trillion worth of demand based off your existing business model, based off your existing set of assumptions, that's just not useful. It's just not useful. And so it has to be driven based on the actual, constraints at the time. And then that's where, everyone has to just be racked and stacked based off the constraints at the time within that market. And so that definitely makes sense. That definitely makes sense. So that demand, that supply demand business model, it gets totally disrupted. And so those assumptions become entirely inaccurate. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. So we just have just a few minutes here before we wind down. And I know, Professor Finkenstadt, you said you had a hard stop. But does anyone, last call, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask both of our distinguished guests? Okay, well, doesn't look like there's any questions, but can our guests, can they reach out to you with any additional questions or follow-on?